All right, so as we continue our conversation about performance appraisals, we need to talk about rating systems. As we said, ultimately the manager's job is to quantify job performance in some way, shape, or form. And what we found, going all the way back to module number 2, whenever we measure anything, in this case we're measuring performance, right? Whenever we measure anything, we're going to measure truth plus error. And so in this particular portion, this little video, we're going to talk about the errors when we measure job performance. Okay? So here is perhaps an overview of how errors or where errors can occur in the system. And what you'll find is if you've ever taken a cognitive psychology step, right, cognitive psychology step, I just read the word step in the corner. If you've ever taken a cognitive psychology course, what you'll find is that this image here has a glaring similarity to an image from a cognitive course. Is where does memory fail us? So where does forgetting happen? Right, things of this nature. So at the point where the manager is supposed to be observing the employee, they may miss something. They weren't there. Yeah, it depends on where the manager is. They may see what they want, that is to say, I don't like this employee. Even though this employee is incredibly effective and they produce lots of products, I don't like them. I will only observe what I want to see, okay? They might not encode it well, right? They might not bring it into their memory systems properly. There might be problems at the storage point, right? That is to say, what do they store? What do they store? And in fact, you could even put in this point where information, that is to say, I watched the employee's behavior and 3 weeks ago they did. Now I need to keep that information in my brain until next month when I write the performance review. So this point here can be a real problem. Retrieving information, maybe you can't get the things out that you need. And then finally at this last stage, which is a lot of what we're going to be talking about, which is the behavioral part, when the physical pen goes to physical paper and puts a number on the paper. Okay? So one of the biggest errors is called a halo error. And a halo error is the idea that even though you're supposed to be evaluating job performance on 15 different dimensions, perhaps a halo error is to all the dimensions are tied to each other in the rater's mind. So if an employee is dependable, then of course they're reliable. Why wouldn't they be? And if they're dependable, then of course they're trustworthy. And it's just like the idea is that the manager should be isolating these different components of job performance, but they don't. They're stuck together. And halo ratings can happen in a lot of cases, in particular when the manager doesn't know about the job that they're, analyzing. And there's a lot of reasons it can happen, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. I mean, it may be correct. We'll come back to that, okay? So halo error, there are statistical ways to figure out whether halo has occurred, but as we say, a lot of things in this world are correlated with each other. I mean, it turns out that if you have relatively high verbal intelligence, then, generally speaking, you will also have somewhat high analytical intelligence. I mean, they're correlated with each other, though they have separate existences, and we could say the different components of job performance have separate existences. As a whole, intelligence is one coherent thing, and job performance is one coherent thing. So in some ways, to try to isolate the different components of job performance can be difficult because they are going to be highly correlated with each other. Okay? So a true halo occurs when the different dimensions of job performance truly are intercorrelated with each other. Okay? You can reduce halo errors, however. I like this idea, is that you rate each trait at a separate time, all right? And that is a fact. When you want to make a rating across 5 dimensions, you rate the first one, and perhaps the first rating you give is somewhat independent or based on your memory of what happened. but the second number that you put down on the paper will be in many ways dependent upon what the first number was. Okay, that's going to be your anchoring point. All right, anchor. There's another cognitive for the day. Okay. Leniency, right? Raters can be lenient in a lot of situations. Maybe the rater likes the ratee, and we talked about that the manager's job is to appraise job performance independent of whether or not they like the person. It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes leniency happens if you want to keep peace. It may be a lot of reasons. It happens in a lot of situations. Okay. You can also have a central tendency error, and that is raters using only the midpoint of the scale. And again, like I had said previously, if you have a Likert scale with 7 points, a central tendency error can occur because the rater just simply has to pick 4 for everybody. Okay. If you have 8 points on your Likert scale, there is no middle, so the central tendency error can be reduced quite simply by having an even number of points on your rating scale. Okay. So a lot of reasons that this can happen, okay? But in a lot of ways, if we remember our normal distribution, the central point is the most frequent score. Therefore, in any performance management cycle, the average score should be the most common. That is the nature of a normal distribution. So the severity error, on the other hand, boy, these managers are dicks, all right? Come on. They tend to use only the low scores for everybody. They're going to try to humble them or motivate them. I don't like these kind of managers. But, okay? Maintain the impression that they're in control. I don't know. It doesn't sound like a good style. We're going to talk about management styles later, okay? Some other errors that can occur can be like the similar to me bias. That is, that employees that are similar to themselves can be rated higher. The proximity, and as I said, this is already what I said, is the first dimension in some way or another might be an independent measure that comes from true ratings, but then all of a sudden this 5 on the first dimension influences the ones next to it. And yeah, this one is interesting. The contrast error, that the rating that somebody gets is a consequence of the last person that was, and yeah, that can happen in grading, by the way. It really does. When I'm grading assignments or something, if the very first one I grade is spectacular, then all of a sudden it becomes really hard to grade the next papers and do so in a neutral fashion. Okay. Some other ones, and again, boy, this is just cognitive psychology for us, because literally I took this figure from my cognitive psychology class. I mean, that's just the way it is. And so what happens is that you could have these primacy and recency effects. That is to say, the primacy effect is something like a first impression. That is, if an employee comes in and makes a major faux pas on day one, but figures out what they did wrong, that is the one event that the manager is going to remember the best. Okay, and then this recency effect, on the other hand, is going to be the function of what have you been doing for the last 3 days. All right, the recency effect is actually not necessarily an error, because you ought to rate the most recent behaviors that an employee has done heavier than the things that they did at the beginning, because it's a learning process. So, could be errors. Okay. Clearly, we can train the managers to rate better, and we can teach them about errors. So, if we can teach the managers about halo errors and leniency errors, and etc., their ratings become more accurate. Okay. Frame of reference. This is actually a pretty good one, because, you know, it was like meets expectations. What does that mean? What is the expectations? Well, that's what frame of reference is in many ways about. That it gives you some kind of a frame upon which to anchor those ratings. And so this is a interesting idea that you have to, and in some kind of a way, a frame of reference training is sort of like having a really good grading rubric. All right, you have a really good grading rubric which establishes what the meets expectations is. All right.